thirsty, come to the well that never runs dry. Drink of the water, come and thirst no more. Come all you sinners, come find His mercy. Come to the table, He will satisfy. Taste of His goodness, find what you're looking for. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. Bring all your failures, bring your addictions, come lay them down at the foot of the cross. Jesus is waiting there with open arms. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. The power of hell forever defeated. Now it is well, and walking in freedom. For God so loved the world. For God so loved the world that He gave us His one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in Him will live forever. The power of hell forever defeated. Now it is well, and walking in freedom. For God so loved the world. Bring all your failures, bring your addictions, come lay them down at the foot of the cross. Jesus is waiting, God so loved the world.
Hey folks, thanks for dialing up CCC today. I'm David Robinson, and last week we launched a series focusing on a portion of the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. And you may know something of Revelation. It's kind of like the zombie apocalypse portion of the Bible because it can be a little creepy, a little crazy. There are battle scenes and creatures and monsters and lakes of fire, and the whole world's at stake. It's pretty crazy at first glance. Revelation, it's this grand vision that comes from God to a man named John, the Apostle John, who's on an island all by himself. He's been exiled to an island called Patmos. And the book of Revelation, it was written at the end of the first century, around 90 AD. It was at a time when the church was in great danger and Christians were facing terrible, terrible persecution. The Roman Emperor Domitian, he was killing anyone who was calling Jesus Lord instead of Him. And John writes this letter to remind Christians and churches that there is a victory to come. And he writes it to remind them that no matter what's going on around them and what's happening to them, the powerful and resilient work of God, it's going on behind the scenes. Jesus is at work and the Spirit of God is at work in the world, and it's all moving toward a triumphant, redemptive ending. And John, he disguises this whole vision with all these symbols and different characteristics. And sometimes when we go back and we try to figure it out now, we come up with crazy answers to what it's really trying to say. We end up missing the point. But ultimately, the point of Revelation, it's encouragement to Christians in the midst of great suffering and struggle that God ultimately wins, and His plan and His purposes, they'll prevail. So hang on to Him. And even when it looks like the empires and the kingdoms of this world are going to have their way, it's just not over. So keep going and keep standing firm and keep fighting the good fight of faith and don't give up. At the beginning of this great big letter of Revelation, there are 7 brief letters that are written to specific churches in the area of Asia Minor, what's now modern day Turkey. And the fact that there are 7 is meant to hint to us something. 7, it symbolizes completeness. And so that kind of tells us, John kind of winks at us, that these letters, they're good for all time. Even though they're for specific places back then, they're for today too, and they still ring true. Each one of them ends with, anyone who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, which is why we're looking at them now. We're approaching our 16-year celebration as a church, and it seems fitting for us to explore each message that was written to each church to see what it might mean for us. 7 letters for 7 churches. And there's a bit of a format to these letters. I mean, each one, it begins with a description of Jesus Christ that's taken from this tremendous imagery of who Jesus is in the first chapter of Revelation. It's a remarkable picture of the resurrected, exalted, cosmic Jesus. But he takes bits and pieces from that description of Jesus for each of these letters. He begins that way. And then he gives some affirmation to the church. And then he gives a warning. And then he gives a promise. And last week we looked at the first letter to the church at Ephesus. This week, letter number 2, which is the shortest letter in all the 7. Let's check it out. It's Revelation 2, beginning in verse 8, just 4 verses total. To the angel in the church of Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came back to life. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. Of all the 7 cities that Jesus mentions in these letters, only Smyrna is still around today. It's the modern city of Izmir in Turkey. Smyrna, in its day, was this exceptionally beautiful city. It was about 40 miles straight north of Ephesus. It was picturesque with its sloping cliffs up to the city where beautiful buildings were built around the slopes of Mount Pagus. It was so impressive with its skyline that it was referred to around the world at that time as the crown of Smyrna. You may want to hang on to that one. It was known throughout the whole Roman Empire as the crown jewel city and one of the most gorgeous places on the planet to live. In fact, it was the model city of the Roman Empire, and they were very proud of themselves. On their coins was an ancient inscription that said, Smyrna, first of Asia in beauty and size. And practically no other city in Asia Minor held as much allegiance to Rome. As early as 195 BC, Smyrna saw the rising star potential of the Roman Empire, and they put their lot in with them. They built a temple where Romans could come and do their polytheistic worship, which, polytheism is just the idea of many, many gods. And that's what the Romans were into. So Smyrna developed this temple where Romans could come to beautiful Smyrna and have a spiritual retreat. Just pick any god you want to in Smyrna. Here a god, there a god, everywhere a god. So it was no surprise when Rome called up Smyrna and said, hey, we want you to build a temple in honor of the emperor so that people can come and everyone can worship the deity of our emperor. And Smyrna obliged. They did just that. They became the center of the cult of emperor worship in the Roman Empire. And this obsessive allegiance of the people of Smyrna, well, it became pretty deadly for Christians. Anything the emperor hated, the people of Smyrna hated too. And emperors like Nero and Domitian, Christians were at the top of their hit list. Anyone swearing allegiance to anybody else other than the emperor, they were seen as a threat and they were to be snuffed out. So nowhere in the first century was it more dangerous to be a Christian than in the crowned jewel city of Smyrna, first in beauty and size. Now, notice how Jesus starts the letter. Look again at what he says there. These are the words of him who is what? First. Him who is first. He's saying, I hear that Smyrna likes to think of itself as first in beauty and size, first of Asia. But listen, I'm the first of Asia. I'm the first of Africa. I'm the first of the Roman Empire and everywhere else. In fact, Jesus says, I spoke every continent into existence. I'm first in beauty and size. I'm just first. Always have been, always will be. And what's more, I'm the last. I'm the inescapable one, the judge of the living and the dead. And I've come to tell you, I know what you're going through. Sometimes it's just good that somebody knows what you're going through. And Jesus says, I know what you're going through. I know your afflictions. I have two older brothers, and when we were growing up, we would play a lot of football. Sometimes, maybe if it was the winter or it was too cold outside or something, we'd end up playing football inside the house. And we broke so many light fixtures and lamps and window panes down through the years that eventually we played what became known as slow motion football. It was really, really goofy when I think back on it. But we would literally was slow motion. It's just stupid, all right? But my brothers, Tim and Jamie, were not just older than me, but they were bigger than me too. And when we would play slow motion football, most of the time, I'd get creamed. I got this old picture of us just to give you a feel for it all. But they would eventually get the upper hand and take me down and essentially end up on top of me, sitting on me sometimes. It was like a couple of boulders resting on me. It's probably where the phrase dumber than a rock came from. But slow motion football always ended the same way, with me on the bottom of the pile and not being able to breathe, with either or the two of them smiling, picking their teeth, sitting on me. I'd say, get off me, get off me, get off me. I can't breathe. And that's how it would end. Anybody else have brothers like that? Mean, ugly, awful brothers? Well, this word for affliction is not a word for like a sporadic sharp pain. It's the word of being crushed under the weight of a boulder. It's the enduring, relentless, squeeze the breath out of you kind of pressure. And Jesus says, I know that every day for you in Smyrna there, you Christians in Smyrna at this church, life is extremely hard simply because you love me and choose to follow me. Maybe you think nobody knows the pain I'm going through, but you'd be wrong. He knows. Jesus knows. Or you think nobody knows how miserable this feels, but you're wrong. He knows. Nobody knows how broken my heart is. Nobody knows how much this hurts. Nobody knows how empty I feel, how lonely I am, but you're wrong because he knows. He really, really knows, and he cares. He's been through it all, man. He is the first and last. He is the one who's with you even now, and he will be forever. So he tells these people, I know your afflictions. And he says, I know your poverty too. Jesus says, I know that you have nothing. I know that many of you are destitute. I know that many of you are jobless. And I know it's not fair either. It's because you follow me. They're discriminating against you because you're a Christian. Most merchants won't sell to you, or they charge you exorbitant prices that you can't afford. I know that against the sparkling backdrop of wealth and splendor in your great city, you're being forced to live in horrendous conditions simply because you love me. I know your poverty, he says. And then he adds, yet you are rich. He says, never, ever forget just how rich you are. You've got this kind of treasure that lasts forever that no one can take away from you. You're spiritually rich because you have the promise of life after death. Because of me, I was dead and I came back to life. Then he says, I also know the slander that's coming your way. I mean, evidently the Roman government had some allies in the form of what Jesus calls in this letter here, some Jews. And he's not talking about a nationality, but he's talking about a group of people who were calling themselves descendants of Abraham, children of the one true God. But by their actions, they more closely resemble what Jesus refers to here as a synagogue of Satan. How would you like to have that label? Synagogue of Satan. Jesus is saying to these people in Smyrna, I know what they're saying about you, and I know who they are, that though they might try to identify with me, they're not with me. So don't be afraid. Don't be misled. Don't be deceived. He's just trying to fill them with encouragement and perspective, knowing that fear is the thief of peace. Jesus says to them, listen, don't be afraid, even though things are going to get rougher than they already are, because I'm with you, and it's not going to last long. He makes this interesting statement about that in verse 10. He says, don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, John uses numbers in a metaphorical way here. He's not saying that you're going to be in prison for a week and a half, some of you. 10 days is an expression for a short time. The idea here is you're going to be in affliction, you're going to be in tribulation and suffering, but put it next to eternity, and how do you compare it? Well, it's like 10 days. It's a short time. So don't quit. Keep hoping. You face unanswered prayer, you face feeling alone, you face relational headache, broken dreams, physical affliction, but your suffering is going to come to an end. And remember, John doesn't say this glibly. He's in prison. He's exiled on an island. He's lost everything. And he says it's just 10 days, more or less. I mean, it's temporary. There's a crown waiting for you and waiting for me. And it's not the crown of Smyrna, that thing over there on the hill. It's the crown of life. If you'll hang on and be faithful and stay the course, then you'll receive the crown of life one day. Because when Jesus died, he came back to life so that when you die, you can live forever. So don't be afraid. Most certainly, when the Christians in Smyrna refused to worship anyone other than Jesus as Lord, they were indeed persecuted. This happened to real people, gang. I mean, think about this. This is our heritage as Christians. Some of them in Smyrna, they were thrown to lions to be eaten. Some of them were burned at the stake. Some of them were covered in skins of animals and thrown to wild dogs. Some of them were covered with tar and lit as human torches. Some of them were crucified just like Jesus. These are the people who are receiving this letter from Jesus through John. And it's interesting, this is one of two churches to whom he gives no reproof. I mean, most of the other churches get warnings, but not Smyrna. These are people that are in the midst of great suffering, but their faith is so strong. You're being faithful in suffering. Just don't stop, Jesus says. It's worth it. I'm worth it. Faithful they were. There's an incredible story a little later in the 2nd century. The head of the church at Smyrna was a man named Polycarp. He was probably ordained by John, probably knew John. By the middle of the 2nd century, he was an old man, and he was brought before the crowds into the arena, and the governor, the proconsul, said to Polycarp, if you don't renounce Jesus, you're going to die. We're going to kill you. Worship Caesar, and you'll live. And this is what Polycarp said. 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I turn my back on my king who has saved me? You threaten me with a fire that burns for a time and is quickly quenched. I will not denounce Jesus. So what are you waiting for? Come, do what you will. And they did. I mean, he was killed. He was burned alive. And I can't imagine that. You probably can't either. You know, of all the 7 letters written here in Revelation to 7 churches, this is probably the one we have the hardest time relating to, this church in Smyrna. Because we're not persecuted here in our country. I mean, the other parts of the world are, but we're free to worship openly here in the United States. We're free to gather and declare Jesus is Lord with no threat of our life. We're kind of on the other side of this. I mean, did you know that the original Constitution of Maryland said you couldn't hold an office in government unless you were a Christian? It was really true. I mean, it doesn't say that anymore, of course, but it started out that way. In our country, we're on the other side of this, which means it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this letter to Smyrna. We could actually use some persecution. I mean, I'm not wishing for it, don't get me wrong, but persecution has a way of purifying. It has a way of reordering what's ultimately important to you. I mean, can you imagine it for a moment? Let's say the state of Maryland declared that you couldn't get any sort of assistance from the state unless you were a member of CCC. You know what would happen? Our numbers would go way up. Our attendance, our membership would go way up. I'm not sure our devotion would be that strong, though. I'm not sure our commitment would be that stable. If the state of Maryland declared that you'd lose your job if you were a part of CCC, or, I don't know, maybe your state taxes would double if you were a member of CCC, you know what would happen? Our numbers would go way down. But for those who stuck around, you know they'd be fully on board, fully in, fully committed. Because persecution has a way of purifying. Now, we're on the other side of this. I think a lot of us, truth be told, a lot of us were kind of ashamed or embarrassed to be labeled or known as a Christian. I mean, the Christians in the first century Smyrna, they're trying to make it through another day as a Christian, just trying to survive. We're often trying to figure out how to fly under the radar at work and not be known as a Christian. I mean, they were hoping not to get killed that day. We're hoping not to be discovered at school as someone who goes to church because, I don't know, we're afraid we'll get labeled as somebody who, is foolish or believes in myths or fairy tales. They were hoping not to be fed by lions for their faith. We're trying not to get our neighbor to think we're weird if we invited them to church. I mean, maybe the way we identify closest to the Christians at Smyrna is when it comes to the slander against them. In a lot of circles, in a lot of places in our culture, people say all sorts of goofy things about Christians. We've kind of become a caricature, and some of that's been earned down through the years. But man, it can push us towards not wanting to identify with being a Christian. You got to have some thick skin if you're going to be openly a Christian, because some folks just put us in a camp, usually with some odd extreme corner on a spectrum. Now, we don't face physical harm, but we can taste a bit of the slander talked about here. One of the things I'm asking everybody to do throughout this series is use it as a chance to assess your own spiritual condition. And when I read this second letter from Jesus to the church at Smyrna, I think, how devoted am I? What am I willing to give up and sacrifice for my relationship with Jesus Christ? What's my commitment level to the Lord? I mean, do I have some measure of the same tenacity and boldness and spiritual grit that these first century Christians had to have? And it makes me think of our church. It makes me think of you. How devoted are you? What's it take for you to say, I'm out? At what price do you give up and check out of faith? Like if your prayer isn't answered in the way and the time you want it answered, then I'm out. If a person you love dies, I'm out. If I'm ridiculed, I'm out. If everyone around me is checking out, well, then I'm out too. If it gets difficult to gather for worship and teaching and communion and fellowship, well, I'm out. When it gets hard or inconvenient, I'm out. I mean, where do you draw the line where you say, I'm out? Is it with your politics or your reputation or your sex life or your money? Like, don't ask me to give, hands off my money. Don't ask me to invite somebody. Where's our spiritual grit? I read this letter to Smyrna and I'm almost embarrassed. What do you think they'd say to us if they showed up here today, these first century Christians being persecuted and afflicted? I think they'd first off probably say, you can worship openly? Are you kidding me? You can sing and worship Jesus as Lord freely? Good night. What's the problem? I also think they'd say, it's worth it. I mean, don't quit. Whatever you're going through, keep going. Don't give up. You can make it. You're not alone. You're surrounded by those who have gone before you and are cheering you on, and you're led fully by Jesus Christ, the Alpha, the Omega, the first, the last, the one who died and has come back to life. And I love how the Bible captures it so well in the book of Hebrews when it's written about that cloud of witnesses. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame. And he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you won't grow weary and lose heart. Don't grow weary and lose heart, CCC. Whoever has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.
We're going to take some time and celebrate communion together. You know, one of the reasons Jesus is so worthy of our praise and our trust is because he made the ultimate sacrifice on the cross for us by purchasing our forgiveness with his life. We remember that sacrifice each week by drinking juice to remind us that his blood was spilled for us and eating bread to remind us that his body was given for us. So go ahead, grab some bread and juice and spend a few minutes reflecting on Jesus, what he's done for you, how he's the one who's worthy of our hearts and trust and devotion. Let's have communion now.
That the highest King would welcome me. I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the sun sets free, always free indeed. I'm a child. He has ransomed me, his grace ransomed. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Oh, the sun sets free, always free indeed. I'm a child. Yes, I am.
again for tuning in and making CCC Online a part of your week. I really hope this online service is the highlight of your week. CCC is all about helping people find their way back to God. And if you're interested in contributing towards that, you can text CCC White Marsh to the number on the screen or click the Give tab at communitycc.net. They're both safe and secure ways to support CCC financially. And if you're in middle or high school, or maybe you're connected with a student, CCC's student ministry is kicking off their 2022 programming this week. Check out the student page on communitycc.net for all the details. And you can see what's in store for trips, retreats, and their weekly programming. And hey, all you couples out there, don't forget about the Fit to be Tied weekend coming up. It's for couples on the path to marriage or married couples looking to invest in their relationship. It's a really cool weekend experience. Check out the events page on CCC's website for more. And don't forget to say hi on social media and connect all week. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next week. Take care, everybody.